There's this big debate happening right now where a lot of people are discussing the value of religion in the contemporary West as the number of religious people has been descending, and we don't really know whether that is a valuable thing from the perspective of the entire population. So this is a big debate. The skeptical community rose to prominence throughout the early 2000s, but it has definitely received a strong pushback more recently with the rise to fame of Jordan Peterson and some forms of the new right, especially in the United States. And this debate, it can be traced from many different areas. And it seems to me that the debate in psychology and the debate in contemporary thinking and sociology has been well elaborated, but it would be useful, it seems to me, to bring a perspective from evolutionary anthropology here. There's one type of evolutionary biologists that, unlike Brett Weinstein and his wife, who have been inserted into this discussion, has an interesting perspective on how to look at groups that I think can be used for human populations that can inform us about the value of different religious groups or irreligious groups, which is the entomologist. So entomologists study insects. They study ants, bees, and non-social insects as well. And the ones that study eosocial species, I guess the most famous one is E.O. Wilson. They conceive of this idea of a superorganism. So what's a superorganism? An anthill is a superorganism. And what that means is that some of the features that normally in animals we find inside a particular individual, as evolution has progressed through time, in these species, those features have moved one level up. That's getting too abstract. Each particular individual doesn't do a specific thing, but a higher level of intelligence exists at the level of the group. So these groups, they behave in ways that can be characterized as intelligent at the level of the group that doesn't necessarily reflect on individual intelligence. And we can look at human religion in a very similar way, because religion seems to make much more sense from the perspective of a group reasoning about how to organize its population and reproduce in the world than from the perspective of a single individual moving about in the world. So the way in which we can use entomology to inform our perspective on human religions and human groups in general is by thinking of a few features that we have in common between groups of eusocial species of insects, like bees, ants, and wasps, and these human groups. So to begin with, both of those are groups that have reproductive function, and usually they have some sort of boundary that constrains who reproduces with whom, right? So it's far more likely to have a religious person have kids with someone else who's from the same religion, and there's some sort of bottleneck in that sense that constrains in insects at the DNA level, but in humans also at the cultural level, what kind of culture is going to be inherited by the children of the people who are participants of that particular group. So besides that, the other feature that human groups have that is comparable to superorganisms, they have this thing called frequency-dependent adaptations. So in humans, the most known frequency-dependent adaptation is the blood group system, where it would be a bad idea for everyone to have blood type A. It would be a bad idea to have everyone have blood type B or blood type O, because then a disease that infects everyone who has a particular type would infect the entire population. So you get an advantage from being in a specific frequency distribution over the population. And that advantage doesn't reflect any particular property of being blood group A or B or O, but it reflects merely the frequency in which that's observed in a population. And religious groups have the same thing, where you have different classes within a religious organization that manage to stabilize the distribution of different types of information within those large groups in different ways. So in the Catholic religion, you have a priest class that usually doesn't reproduce genetically, so they're not transferring DNA information, but they do transfer a fair amount of the ritualistic information that's part of the evolutionary macrosystem that is being passed from generation to generation within that particular Christian sect. And you also have these functional adaptations. So at any given time within a religion, you're going to have a different number of priests. There's a different number of like female priestesses classes in some religions. You observe different functional specializations that are not just the functional specialization of sex, which the majority of species have. So the way that you differentiate something that is just evolving at a group level and participating in group level selection, that is something that as a group reproduces itself over time, from something that is fundamentally selfish from a biological perspective or from an evolutionary perspective, is whether there are features that are deleterious to the individual but beneficial to the group that end up being passed on over time. And if that group has particular properties that delineate within the group a functional adaptation that separates that population into subpopulations that are supposed to execute different functions, either in the case of ants, for instance, you have soldier ants, you have reproductive male ants. Actually, you have different tiers of soldier ants. In some ant species, there are ants that they form a bulbous sac just to store water and sugar in order to serve that water and sugar to the other ants later down the road. So that kind of specialization that you see both in ant groups and in some human groups is another reason to potentially qualify Christian groups and other religions as a form of superorganism, because they have these boundaries and these restrictions, and they're still reproducing themselves in time. I think this is valuable if you insert it into these big discussions that are happening now about religion in the West and religion's increase and decrease, because there's been a paper recently that showed that when people drop out of religion, when people stop being religious, it seems that there's a fork of sorts where there's two different places where you can go from there. And a substantial fraction of the people who drop out of religion become far more nationalistic. So you could say that they move strongly towards the right wing of the political spectrum. And there's another fraction that becomes more likely to be possessed by some sort of ideological groupthink that contemporarily is more common in the left wing, whereas religion continues to guarantee that people are focused on individual level reasoning, and that the group with which they identify being the group of the religion as a whole, it might have different conditions of entry and for exit than nations, and different conditions for who you should treat well than identity politics and left-wing thoughts. So one possible way to conceptualize a value that exists in religion that doesn't exist in the secular populations that are beginning to form is that religions prevent that level of polarization by not letting people go into those two modules of thinking, one of which, very strong nationalism, the other very strong association with a particular group or ideology, like a framework through which to see the world in which everything is explained by, an oppressor class and an oppressed class. And with the loss of religion in the West, both of these have been at different times and in different situations very dangerous problems. And I don't think we know very well yet. I don't know to what extent we can let go of the value of having this superorganismic structure with its particular subform of functional differentiation and hierarchies and the way in which its boundaries are open and let people move in and out, in comparison to the expected population distribution if pretty much everyone stopped being religious later down the road. One reason why I think it's important to start thinking about religion, but in particular thinking about Christianity as a superorganism, as a group of biological and cultural entities that evolve together with these functional dependencies and functional differentiations intra-group, is because it's only by understanding which levels of intelligence are available to these superorganismic groups in biology and in other evolutionary systems that we will understand what is part of the value that we are losing by discoordinating society in a sense and letting go of one type of group structure in which to arrange humans into either having separate individuals or having a more discoordinated group that isn't organized around the functional hierarchies and dependencies that are intrinsic to religious systems. So this is a separate question from the reality and the truth of any metaphysical claim of religion, right? So it may be that religion has truth, but that is not the issue. It may be that religion has psychological and historical value, and that the stories of religion are useful in order to help the development of the psychology of individuals. And that's basically the point that Jordan Peterson has been pressing in the media in the last year and a half or so. But that's also not the issue. The issue here is from the perspective of the dynamics of populations, are we gaining moral, ethical value by reducing the proportion of people who participate in this particular kind of superorganismic functional organization, or are we gaining value from that? Because these are evolutionary systems. So when you consider them, you can't consider only whether they seem moral as observed from the inside, or whether they seem moral as observed from the bird's eye view, from a perspective of someone who's just like an arbitrary neutral observer from above. Because the thing about systems that have this kind of functional differentiation and biological differentiation is that they are evolutionary competitors, right? So all at the same time, there's different groups and units of selection and levels of evolutionary selection that are competing against each other. So even if there is a group that is far more moral than every other group, it doesn't necessarily mean that it will be more moral over the entire course of time, because it may be a group that will just dwindle until it fades completely. So I guess the question that I'm interested in, and the reason why I got interested in religion to begin with, and in superorganisms as an explanatory mechanism for religions to begin with, is the question of how can you get the maximum number of people overall to experience the maximum number of good mental states. And in order to assess that, it's insufficient to know who are your evolutionary competitors and then judge them morally. It's also necessary to know how effective they are in the evolutionary battles against each other, right? So if you have far more kids, or if your army is far more effective, even if you are less moral, over the grand course of time, there will have been more members of your particular class or clan or group. And with that, it becomes necessary to do this mixed evaluation, right? So you have to make some level of concession to things that would otherwise be immoral in order to guarantee that they will be sufficiently long-lived that in the full course of history, there will have been more entities that participated in that group. So that's basically why I'm interested in Christianity as a superorganism and in religions as a superorganism in general. And why I think that despite there being a lot of different aspects of Christianity in particular, that for our secular minds in the 21st century might look like they're either false or downright immoral, they're not necessarily moral if you consider the full course of time and in which ways they have created a good state of affairs for those who partook in the civilizations that were created from that system. So I want to continue that type of discussion. If you have any idea about how to think about groups like that, or whether that analogy is also valuable for instance, religions in India, which I'm not very familiar with, or if you're just curious about a specific way in which that might affect our moral judgment of different religions or groups, let me know. If you like this, please subscribe, click like, do all the other things that people do in videos like that. I hope I'll see you next time. I'll definitely be coming back to this topic with some regularity. So I hope you come back with as many interesting thoughts to this as I will. See you next time.